Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. If you enjoy mysterious inheritances, hidden truths, and life-changing discoveries, you're in the right place. Share this video with someone who loves powerful stories. And now, let's begin. Lauren Brooks had always believed her life followed a predictable, almost deliberately modest rhythm. At 36, she lived alone in a quiet rental townhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a place defined more by consistency than ambition. Her days were structured around her work as a crisis support consultant, a profession she had chosen not for recognition or income, but for its sense of purpose. She spent her hours listening to stories of fear, grief, and uncertainty, helping others find footing during the most unstable moments of their lives. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals, read before bed, and maintained a routine that felt earned and intentional. It was a life built on stability, not surprises. Her relationship with her family was cordial, but emotionally reserved. She spoke with her parents regularly, though the conversations rarely strayed beyond surface updates about health, work, or weather. Family history had never been a subject of interest in her household. There were no dramatic stories passed down, no distant relatives spoken of with intrigue, no lingering mysteries that invited questions. Lauren had grown up believing her family tree was small, uncomplicated, and firmly rooted in the present. That assumption had always suited her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the routine correspondence, utility bills, a flyer from a local grocery store, and an envelope bearing the name of a legal firm she did not recognize. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, perhaps intended for a previous tenant. It was only when she saw her full name typed neatly beneath the address that she paused. The paper felt heavier than expected when she opened it, as if the contents carried more weight than the envelope suggested. The message was brief, formal, and unsettlingly vague. It informed her that she had been named the beneficiary of an estate belonging to a deceased individual and requested her presence at the firm's office to discuss the matter in person. There was no explanation of who this individual was, no hint of the nature of the inheritance, only a signature from a senior attorney and a time suggested for a meeting later that week. Lauren reread the letter several times, waiting for recognition to surface, for a name or detail to trigger a memory. Nothing did. Both of her parents were alive and well. She had no siblings. Extended family gatherings had never included unfamiliar faces. The idea that someone outside her immediate awareness had chosen her as an heir felt implausible, almost intrusive. Yet the letter was real, printed on official letterhead, impossible to dismiss. She spent the rest of the day distracted, her thoughts drifting during conversations with clients and paperwork alike. That evening, she called her parents, casually mentioning the letter without assigning it much importance. They expressed mild surprise but offered no insight. Neither recognized the name of the legal firm, and neither could think of a relative who might have passed away recently. The conversation ended without answers, leaving Lauren with a growing sense of unease. On Friday morning, she drove to the address listed in the letter. The firm occupied a restored brick building downtown, its appearance conservative and unremarkable. Inside, the office was quiet, almost solemn, as if designed to encourage restraint rather than curiosity. She was ushered into a private room where an older attorney waited, his demeanor professional and carefully neutral. What he told her challenged every assumption she held about her family and her place within it. A man named Samuel Hawthorne, identified as a distant relative through a lineage Lauren had never known existed, had died several weeks earlier. He had left no immediate family, and his estate documents named Lauren Brooks as the sole inheritor of his primary property. The attorney spoke as though this information should clarify things, but it only deepened her confusion. The nature of the inheritance was revealed slowly, almost deliberately. It was not a sum of money, nor a collection of valuables easily transferred. It was a property, singular and highly unconventional. A floating residence, constructed decades earlier and anchored in the center of a remote lake in northern Maine. The attorney referred to it as a homestead, though the word felt inadequate. It was described as large, self-sustaining, and architecturally unique, more akin to a private island than a house. Lauren listened in silence as documents were placed before her. A map marked with the lake's location, a set of coordinates, photographs taken from a distance that showed a massive structure rising from the water, its silhouette both imposing and oddly isolated. Finally, a key, worn but carefully maintained, was set on the table between them. She stared at it, struggling to connect this physical object with the abstract notion of inheritance. She was told that the property had been maintained independently for years and that no additional explanation accompanied the bequest. There was no letter, no personal note, no justification for why she had been chosen. The attorney explained that he had been instructed to contact her upon the owner's death and to provide access to the property, nothing more. The decision to accept or decline the inheritance rested entirely with her. Driving home, Lauren felt disconnected from the familiar landscape around her. The streets she knew so well seemed altered, as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis. The idea that somewhere, less than a day's drive away, there existed a place tied to her by blood, yet entirely unknown to her, unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that declining the inheritance was an option, that she could sign a document and return to her carefully ordered life. But the thought offered no relief. That night she slept poorly. Images of the lake and the floating structure drifted through her dreams, indistinct but persistent. By morning she understood that uncertainty would not allow her peace. She needed to see the place, if only to confirm that it held no meaning for her and could be dismissed as an anomaly. She requested time off from work, citing a personal matter she did not attempt to explain. Packing was done methodically, a single suitcase filled with practical clothing, toiletries, and a notebook she carried more out of habit than intention. She added a small folder containing the documents from the attorney, folding the map carefully before placing it inside. Before leaving, she stood in her quiet living room, observing the life she had built. Everything felt grounded, earned, and known. The thought that this stability might soon be challenged filled her with equal parts apprehension and resolve. She locked the door behind her and started the drive northeast, unsure of what awaited her, but certain that whatever lay ahead would demand her attention. The road stretched long and steady, carrying her away from familiarity and toward questions she had never thought to ask. As miles passed and landscapes changed, Lauren felt the first subtle shift within herself, a quiet awareness that the inheritance was not merely a legal transaction. It was an invitation into a story that had begun long before she was aware of it, and one she could no longer ignore. By the time Lauren crossed into Maine, the sense of departure that had accompanied her since leaving Iowa had deepened into something heavier and more introspective. The landscape grew denser with forests, the roads narrower and quieter, as though guiding her away from the open familiarity of the Midwest into a more guarded, inward place. She stopped once at a roadside diner, eating mechanically while studying the folded map beside her plate. The lake's name was printed there in small, unassuming letters, offering no hint of why it seemed to unsettle everyone who mentioned it. The farther she drove, the more she felt as though she were approaching not merely a destination, but a boundary. The town nearest the lake was small, even by rural standards. A cluster of buildings gathered around a single main road, with a gas station, a general store, and a handful of aging houses that bore the marks of long winters and quiet persistence. There was nothing remarkable about the place at first glance, yet Lauren sensed an undercurrent of restraint in the way people moved, as if the town existed in careful balance with something it preferred not to acknowledge. She parked near the lake's edge and stepped out of the car. The water stretched wide and still, framed by dark evergreens that reflected faintly on its surface. At the center, unmistakable even from a distance, stood the structure she had seen in the photographs. The floating house dominated the lake not through ornament, but through sheer presence. It rose solidly from the water, its scale disproportionate to its surroundings, as if it had drifted in from another world and settled where it did not quite belong. Lauren stood there longer than she intended, absorbing the sight. The house did not appear abandoned. From afar it seemed intact, deliberate, and anchored with quiet certainty. There were no visible signs of decay, no obvious neglect. Instead, it projected a sense of endurance that unsettled her more than disrepair would have. It was not a ruin left behind, it was something maintained, waiting. She turned away reluctantly and walked toward the general store, hoping to gather some context before attempting to reach the house itself. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and old paper. Shelves were stocked with necessities rather than variety, and a bell chimed softly as she entered. The woman behind the counter looked up, her expression neutral but watchful. Lauren purchased a bottle of water and, as casually as she could manage, asked about the lake. The response was immediate but restrained. The woman's movements slowed, her eyes flicking briefly toward the window before returning to Lauren. She offered little information, speaking in general terms about the weather, the fishing seasons, and the town's history, but avoided any mention of the house itself. When Lauren pressed gently, asking about the structure in the middle of the lake, the woman's demeanor cooled. She replied that it had been there longer than most people could remember, and that it was not a subject locals enjoyed discussing. This pattern repeated itself as Lauren spoke with others. An older man outside the store, a pair of residents sitting near the dock, even the attendant at the small marina, all responded with similar unease. Some claimed ignorance, others offered vague warnings, but none provided concrete details. The house, it seemed, existed in a kind of communal silence, acknowledged only indirectly and never explored openly. Through these fragmented interactions, Lauren pieced together a rough impression. The previous owner had lived alone. Supplies were rarely seen arriving during daylight hours. Boats had been spotted moving across the lake late at night, their presence noted but never investigated. No one recalled the man visiting town or engaging with the community. He had existed on the margins, visible yet unreachable, a figure defined more by absence than action. The lake itself appeared calm, almost deceptively so, but Lauren sensed that its stillness was part of the reason for the town's discomfort. It reflected rather than revealed, holding secrets beneath its surface. Standing at the edge, she felt a subtle pressure, as though the water marked a threshold between the known and the deliberately forgotten. Determined to proceed, Lauren made her way along the shoreline until she reached a modest boat rental shack. The building looked weathered but functional, its presence suggesting that the lake was used, if cautiously. Inside, she found a woman seated behind a small desk, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. Lauren explained her situation carefully, describing the inheritance and her need to reach the floating house. She did not embellish or dramatize, hoping that honesty might succeed where curiosity had failed. The reaction was immediate and firm. The woman listened without interruption, her expression growing more guarded with each detail. When Lauren finished, she shook her head slowly, making it clear that she had no interest in being involved. The house, she explained, was not a place people visited. It inspired discomfort, unease, and a persistent sense that it should not exist where it did. She refused to rent a boat for the purpose of reaching it. Lauren felt a flicker of frustration but did not argue. Instead, she lingered, asking neutral questions about the lake, the town, the seasons. Gradually, the tension softened, though it did not disappear. After a long pause, the woman relented slightly, offering a compromise that carried clear boundaries. She would take Lauren out to the house and return the following day, but she would not stay, explore, or provide assistance beyond transportation. The agreement felt fragile, but Lauren accepted it without hesitation. She understood that any further insistence might close the door entirely. As they prepared the boat, the weight of the decision settled over her. The house, which had seemed distant and abstract only hours earlier, now loomed as an imminent reality. The boat ride was quiet, the engine's low hum the only sound breaking the stillness of the lake. As they moved away from shore, the town receded quickly, its buildings shrinking until they blended into the tree line. The floating house grew larger with each passing moment, its scale becoming increasingly apparent. From this closer vantage, Lauren could see details that had been invisible from land. Reinforced platforms beneath the structure, thick cables anchoring it to unseen points below the water. Windows positioned to survey the lake in every direction. The dock extending from the house was narrow and functional, designed for access rather than comfort. The boat eased alongside it, rocking gently with the movement of the water. Lauren stepped onto the dock, feeling its subtle sway beneath her feet. The sensation reinforced the isolation of the place, the knowledge that solid ground was now several hundred yards away. Without ceremony, the boat departed, turning back toward shore and leaving Lauren alone. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the quiet lapping of water against the structure. She stood there for a moment, steadying herself, aware that this was the point of no return. The lake stretched around her, vast and indifferent, while the house waited in silence. As she turned toward the door, key in hand, Lauren felt the culmination of the day's unease crystallize into resolve. Whatever secrets the lake held, whatever history the house concealed, she had crossed the boundary willingly. The silence of the town, the reluctance of its people, and the weight of the inheritance all converged in this moment. With a final glance at the distant shoreline, she stepped forward, carrying with her the certainty that the answers she sought would not be found by turning back. The door closed behind Lauren with a muted, deliberate sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. For a brief moment she stood motionless in the entryway, her hand still resting on the handle, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. It was not the hollow silence of abandonment, nor the chaotic stillness of neglect. Instead, it felt composed, controlled, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The air carried a faint, dry scent of old wood and metal, mixed with something cleaner, almost sterile, that reminded her of laboratories she had visited during college. It was the smell of maintenance rather than decay. Light filtered in through tall windows set high into the walls, softened by curtains that had been drawn but not fully closed. Dust motes drifted slowly, visible only when they crossed the pale beams of daylight. The floor beneath her feet was solid and steady, despite the subtle movement of the structure floating on water. The house swayed almost imperceptibly, a gentle reminder of where it stood, yet everything inside had been designed to counteract that motion. Shelves were reinforced, furniture anchored, objects placed with intention. Lauren moved deeper into the house, her footsteps measured, her senses alert. The entryway opened into a long corridor that curved slightly, following the shape of the structure. Along the walls hung framed photographs and paintings, spaced evenly, their arrangement careful and deliberate. Many depicted the lake in different seasons, captured from various angles and elevations. Some showed the house itself, viewed from the shoreline or from the air, as though the photographer had wanted to document its presence from every possible perspective. Others focused on details, the water's surface under ice, the reflection of clouds at dusk, the faint wake left by a passing boat. As she walked, Lauren became increasingly aware of a sensation she could not immediately name. It was not fear, nor exactly curiosity, but something closer to recognition. The house felt observant, not in a supernatural sense, but as a place shaped by years of attention. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing had been left to chance. The corridor led into a large central room that appeared to serve as a living area. Furniture was arranged for function rather than comfort, though it was neither cold nor uninviting. A long table dominated the center of the space, its surface marked with faint scratches and stains that spoke of use rather than neglect. Along one wall stood cabinets filled with neatly labeled binders and notebooks. Lauren approached them, running her fingers lightly along the spines. Dates stretched back decades, each volume meticulously organized. Many bore technical titles referencing atmospheric patterns, water currents, structural integrity, and environmental shifts. She opened one at random. Inside were pages of dense handwriting, diagrams sketched with precision, and data tables carefully aligned. The observations were detailed, consistent, and continuous, as though the author had devoted his life to recording the behavior of the world around him. This was not the work of a hobbyist. It was the labor of someone deeply committed to understanding, perhaps even anticipating, change. Moving into an adjacent room, Lauren discovered what appeared to be a study. A large desk faced a window overlooking the lake, positioned to provide an uninterrupted view of the horizon. On the desk lay instruments she recognized only vaguely, measuring devices, charts, and a telescope mounted near the window, angled outward. The desk itself was cluttered, but not chaotically so. Papers were stacked in careful piles, each aligned as though their owner knew exactly where everything belonged. It was there that Lauren noticed the first detail that made her pause. Among the documents lay a small envelope, its edges softened by handling. Her name was written on the front in a careful, deliberate script. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she held it, feeling the weight of the paper, the implication of its presence. This was no coincidence. Her name had been placed here intentionally, waiting. She set the envelope aside and continued exploring, her movements now slower, more cautious. The house revealed itself room by room, each space offering further insight into the life of its former occupant. There was a library filled with books spanning a wide range of subjects: engineering, meteorology, psychology, philosophy. Many bore handwritten notes in the margins. Some underlined passages marked with symbols Lauren did not recognize. The books had been read, reread, and engaged with deeply, not collected for appearance or prestige. Upstairs, the rooms grew more personal. Bedrooms were sparsely furnished, functional rather than indulgent. One room in particular drew her attention. Inside, a series of clocks lined the walls and shelves. Each stopped at a different time. Their faces varied in style and age, but all were carefully maintained, their mechanisms clean and intact despite their stillness. The effect was unsettling, as though time itself had been fragmented and stored here in pieces. On a small dresser beneath one of the clocks lay a locket. Lauren picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of an infant, wrapped in a blanket, its features soft and indistinct. Beneath the image, engraved into the metal, was a name she recognized instantly: her surname. The sight struck her with unexpected force, knocking the air from her lungs. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, the locket still open in her palm. Questions surged through her mind, colliding and overlapping. How had this man known her? Why had he kept this? What connection could possibly exist between her quiet life and this isolated, meticulously constructed world? She felt a growing sense of unease, not rooted in danger, but in intimacy. The realization that her life had been observed, recorded, and preserved without her knowledge was profoundly destabilizing. She continued through the house, her earlier curiosity now tempered by apprehension. In a storage room, she found boxes filled with newspaper clippings. Many were marked with dates and annotations. One headline caught her attention immediately, circled in red ink. It described the disappearance of a young girl during a school outing, followed by her unexplained return days later, unharmed but unable to recall what had happened. The date corresponded exactly to an incident from Lauren's own childhood, a memory that had always remained oddly incomplete. Her hands shook as she replaced the clipping. The implications were too large to process all at once. This house, this man, had not merely existed parallel to her life. They had intersected in ways she had never been aware of. The feeling that had followed her since entering the house now sharpened into clarity. She was not simply a visitor here. She was part of the narrative that had shaped this place. By the time she returned to the central living area, the light outside had begun to fade. The lake beyond the windows reflected the dimming sky, its surface smooth and unreadable. Lauren stood alone in the vast space, surrounded by evidence of a life devoted to observation, preparation, and secrecy. The envelope bearing her name lay where she had left it, waiting. She picked it up, but once again did not open it. Some instinct told her that understanding would not come in fragments. There was a structure to this revelation, a sequence she was meant to follow. For now, she needed rest, time to gather herself before confronting whatever truths lay deeper within the house. As she prepared for the night, choosing a small guest room that appeared recently maintained, Lauren felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. The house creaked softly around her, responding to the gentle movement of the water below. It no longer felt like a stranger's dwelling. It felt like a place that had anticipated her arrival. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Lauren understood that the inheritance was not an accident, nor a gesture made in passing. The house knew her because it had been built around her absence, shaped by years of watching from a distance. Sleep eventually came, heavy and restless, carrying her toward answers she could sense were waiting beneath the surface, just out of reach. Lauren woke sometime after midnight with the uneasy sense that the house had shifted around her. For a moment she lay still, listening, unsure whether the sensation had come from within a dream or from the structure itself. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the curtains. The lake beyond the window was invisible, yet she could feel its presence, an immense and silent mass pressing against the floating foundations below. The gentle sway she had noticed earlier felt more pronounced now, as though the house were responding to something unseen beneath the surface. A low metallic sound drifted through the stillness, distant but distinct. It was not loud enough to startle, yet it carried a weight that pulled her fully into wakefulness. It came again, followed by a subtle vibration that traveled through the floor. Lauren sat up slowly, her heart beating faster, her senses sharpened. The house was not settling, not shifting randomly. Something had moved. She rose from the bed and stepped into the hallway, the cool floor grounding her as she moved. The silence had changed. It was no longer passive. It felt expectant, as though the house were guiding her attention toward a particular place. She followed the sensation rather than a sound, moving instinctively through corridors she had already walked, now altered by shadow. The familiar spaces felt narrower at night, their proportions distorted by darkness and uncertainty. As she passed the study, a faint draft brushed against her arm. She paused, turning toward the sensation. One of the tapestries along the wall stirred slightly, though there was no open window nearby. Curious, she reached out and drew the heavy fabric aside. Behind it, concealed almost perfectly within the wall, was a narrow door she had not noticed before. Its surface was metal rather than wood, cool to the touch and marked with faint scratches that suggested frequent use. Lauren hesitated only briefly before turning the handle. The door opened inward, revealing a tight spiral staircase descending into darkness. A faint, sterile scent rose from below, sharper than the air upstairs. She retrieved a flashlight from her bag and began the descent, her footsteps echoing softly as she moved downward. With each step, the temperature dropped slightly, and the air grew heavier, tinged with moisture and something faintly mineral. By the time she reached the bottom, Lauren was certain she had passed below the waterline. The walls around her were reinforced with steel and concrete, their surfaces smooth and meticulously maintained. The corridor ahead was long and narrow, illuminated by recessed lights that flickered to life as she stepped forward. Motion sensors, she realized, integrated seamlessly into the structure. Along both sides of the corridor stood rows of drawers and cabinets, each labeled with careful precision. Categories were etched directly into the metal: environmental data, correspondence, research logs, genealogical records. The labels were not decorative. They were functional, systematic, the work of someone who valued order above all else. Lauren moved slowly, her attention drawn to a section marked with her surname. Her hands trembled as she opened the first drawer. Inside were letters, neatly stacked and organized by date. Many were addressed to people she recognized as members of her family. Some bore her parents' names. Others referenced addresses from her childhood. None appeared to have been sent. They were drafts, carefully composed and never delivered. She read several, her mind struggling to absorb the implications. The letters spoke of concern, of distance maintained deliberately, of observation conducted from afar. There was no tone of malice, no sense of intrusion for its own sake. Instead, they conveyed restraint, regret, and a persistent belief that separation had been necessary. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy vault door, its surface polished and marked with a single phrase etched above the handle. It indicated restricted access, though the wording suggested intention rather than prohibition. Beside the door was a biometric panel, its screen dark. As Lauren approached, it activated, responding to her presence. A soft hum filled the air as the system processed. Then a quiet click signaled acceptance. The door unlocked without her touching it. Inside, the room was larger than she expected, circular in shape and carefully insulated. At its center stood a single chair facing a wall-mounted screen. The lights dimmed automatically as she entered, and the screen flickered to life. An image appeared, slightly grainy but unmistakably real. A man sat facing the camera, his posture rigid, his expression composed yet weary. His features bore a resemblance that made Lauren's breath catch, subtle but undeniable. The recording began without preamble. The man introduced himself not as the distant relative she had been told about, but as someone far closer. He explained his life in measured detail, describing years devoted to scientific research, to preparing for scenarios he believed the world was unprepared to face. He spoke of isolation chosen deliberately, of the house as both refuge and laboratory. As the recording continued, the truth emerged with quiet inevitability. He revealed that he was Lauren's biological parent. The words landed not as a shock, but as a convergence, aligning fragments she had not known were connected. He described her birth, the loss that followed, and the decision that had shaped her entire life. Believing himself unfit to raise a child, burdened by grief and obsession, he had entrusted her to others who could offer stability and normalcy. He had remained distant by design, watching from afar, ensuring her safety without interfering in her development. Lauren felt her strength drain away as the implications settled. She sank into the chair, her body heavy, her thoughts racing. The man on the screen continued, his voice steady but strained. He spoke of guilt carried quietly, of love expressed through absence rather than presence. The house, he explained, had been built not merely as a sanctuary for himself, but as a place where truth could wait until the right moment. He had not wanted to disrupt her life, only to leave her a choice when she was ready. The recording ended as abruptly as it had begun. The screen went dark, and the room returned to silence. Lauren sat motionless, tears tracing silent paths down her face. Her entire sense of self felt unmoored, the foundation of her identity shifting beneath her. Memories resurfaced with new context, moments from her childhood now reframed by knowledge she had never possessed. She remained there for a long time, her thoughts moving slowly as she grappled with the weight of what she had learned. Anger flickered briefly, followed by sorrow, then a profound sense of loss for a relationship that had existed only in fragments. Yet beneath it all was an unexpected undercurrent of understanding. The choices made had been rooted in fear and care, not indifference. When Lauren finally stood and retraced her steps up the spiral staircase, the house above felt different. It was no longer a mystery shaped by observation alone. It was a testament to restraint, to a love expressed through preparation rather than proximity. Emerging into the dimly lit hallway, she felt exhausted yet clearer than she had in years. As she returned to her room, dawn had begun to edge faintly against the horizon. The lake outside was still, its surface untouched, holding secrets now partially revealed. Lauren lay down once more, her mind heavy but steady. The truth had not freed her from pain, but it had given shape to questions that had long gone unspoken. In the quiet that followed, she understood that the house had not been watching her to claim her life, but to return it to her, whole at last. Morning came quietly, as though the lake itself had chosen not to disturb Lauren after the night she had endured. Pale light seeped through the windows, dissolving the shadows that had weighed so heavily on the house hours earlier. The structure no longer felt watchful or tense. Instead, it seemed subdued, almost relieved, as if its long-held burden had finally been acknowledged. Lauren woke with a dull ache behind her eyes and a heaviness in her chest that had not yet settled into any single emotion. She lay still for a time, listening to the faint movement of water beneath the foundations, letting the truth she had uncovered settle into something she could carry. She moved through the house slowly, no longer exploring but revisiting, seeing each room through a new lens. The study overlooking the lake was no longer merely a workspace, but a vantage point from which a life had been quietly observed and guarded. The library was not an archive of obsession but of preparation. Even the clocks, frozen at different hours, now felt less unsettling and more symbolic. Markers of moments preserved rather than lost. The house had not been built to imprison the past, but to contain it until it could be faced. When Lauren stepped out onto the dock, the lake greeted her with a stillness that mirrored her own fragile calm. The shoreline felt impossibly distant, a reminder of how isolated this place truly was. She stood there until she heard the faint approach of a motor, watching as the small boat drew nearer. The woman who had brought her here the day before slowed as she reached the dock, her expression cautious but curious. Lauren boarded without ceremony, carrying only her bag and the knowledge she could not yet fully articulate. The ride back was quiet. The town came back into view, unchanged and yet profoundly altered in Lauren's perception. What had once felt guarded and secretive now seemed protective, as though the people here had been keeping a vigil rather than hiding a truth. When her feet touched solid ground again, she felt a subtle shift within herself, the awareness that she was not leaving the house behind so much as carrying it with her. The drive home passed in a haze. Lauren replayed fragments of the recording in her mind, not obsessively, but deliberately, as if memorizing something fragile. She knew she would need to speak to her parents to bring the truth into the open rather than letting it fester in silence. When she arrived, she found them as she always had, familiar and grounding, unaware of how much the foundation of her understanding had changed. The conversation that followed was not easy, but it was honest. Lauren shared what she had learned, watching as shock gave way to sorrow, then to a quiet acceptance. Her parents spoke of choices made long ago, of promises kept and boundaries respected, of a shared belief that love sometimes required restraint. There was grief in the room, but there was also relief, the kind that comes from finally naming something that has lingered unspoken for years. When the conversation ended, Lauren felt closer to them than she had in a long time, not because the past had been perfect, but because it had been acknowledged. That night, lying in her own bed, Lauren stared at the ceiling she had known for years. It felt both smaller and more secure than it ever had before. She understood now that identity was not a fixed thing bestowed at birth, but a structure built over time, shaped by truth, choice, and understanding. The revelation had not rewritten her life, but it had filled in its margins, giving context to silences she had never questioned. In the weeks that followed, Lauren returned to the lake often, though never with the intention of staying. Each visit felt purposeful rather than compelled. She began the slow process of restoring the house, not to preserve it as a monument, but to transform it into something that could breathe. She reached out to local officials, educators, and environmental organizations, sharing the vision that had taken shape quietly in her mind. The house, with its infrastructure and archives, could become a place of learning, research, and refuge, honoring the work that had begun there while opening its doors to others. The town responded cautiously at first, then with growing interest. The same people who had once avoided the lake began to see it differently, not as a source of unease, but as a resource reclaimed. Volunteers offered time and expertise. Students visited to learn about environmental monitoring and resilience. The house filled with voices, footsteps, and purpose, shedding the silence that had defined it for so long. Lauren watched this transformation with a sense of fulfillment that surprised her. She did not feel as though she were inheriting a burden, nor even a legacy in the traditional sense. What she had received was an opportunity to decide what came next. By choosing not to live in the house but to share it, she felt she was honoring both the intention behind its creation and the life she had built for herself. Standing once more on the dock at dusk, Lauren looked back at the floating structure, now lit from within, alive in a way it never had been before. It no longer belonged to a ghost or to secrecy. It belonged to the present and to the people who would carry its purpose forward. The lake reflected the light softly, holding them without distortion. Lauren turned toward the shore, her steps steady. She knew where she came from now, but more importantly, she knew where she stood. The inheritance had not changed who she was. It had simply revealed the depth of what she could become. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more original stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Share this video with someone who loves deep, meaningful stories, and check out the other videos on the channel for more unforgettable journeys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.